Hi, thank you for tuning in to this anti-war committee event. We see that we've got people who have logged on. We see that Misty is leading chants with people from across the country to say free, free Palestine. That's awesome. Um, I want to say thank you to you for tuning in. We hope that more will continue to join us. You can share this event on Facebook, so maybe you could start a viewing party and encourage more people to join with us. When this event is done, there'll be a video that you can then use that you can share with other people if you like it, so you could get more people to watch it. I also want to say thank you to our speakers. We're really excited about tonight's program. When we planned this program as the anti-war committee a couple weeks ago, we didn't know that it would actually be the same day as the protest that we were having locally in solidarity with people in Portland. But it actually seems pretty fitting that we're doing these two events on the same day because there's lots of similarities between how the IDF occupies Palestine and the role that federal troops are playing, like that, the Department of Homeland Security and other federal forces are playing in Portland. And there's similarities in terms of tactics, but there's also similarities in terms of the reason why. In that both of these situations, troops are being used in a desperate attempt to try to squelch protest and silence dissent. But in both situations as well, people are refusing to back down and people are not saying that they're interested in being quiet. And a matter of fact, for every time another person gets, clubbed or like abducted, in Portland, more people are showing up into the streets. And we've been seeing the same thing happening in Palestine for decades. And so we think that this is fitting to have this. And we really appreciate the fact that some of our viewers literally just got home from, protesting in Minneapolis. Two of our speakers today just got here from protesting in Minneapolis. And so that fits. We originally organized this event in an attempt to be able to move our Palestine organizing forward. We, the anti-war committee, have been, working in solidarity with Palestine and against U.S. military aid to Israel since a little bit before the Second Intifada. But since we were in the epicenter of this summer's uprising, we have actually not done as much Palestine organizing as we would have normally, because we've been really spending a lot of our energy supporting the Black Lives Matter movement here in the Twin Cities. And we organized this event in an effort to try to pivot to doing some more of our anti-war organizing and our Palestine solidarity work, but also because we are always seeing these connections between the struggle for Black lives and the struggle for Palestine. And we wanted to have an event to sort of help other people who maybe didn't see or recognize these connections to be able to see them. For those of you who are tuning in who aren't familiar with the Anti-War Committee, we are based in Minneapolis, St. Paul in Minnesota. We're an all grassroots organization, and we organize political pressure, mostly through protests, but we do other forms of organizing as well to challenge US imperialism. And Palestine has been one of our main campaigns because we see that Palestinian liberation is key to peace throughout the Middle East. And we think that that's important. We also think that the US plays an incredibly horrible and destructive role in the Middle East in general, but we really see that the way that the US operates in Israel, treating it like the 51st state, is a way that it then uses its situation in Israel to be able to try to control the rest of the Middle East. So we spent a lot of energy trying to end and challenge US military aid to Israel. We consider ourselves part of the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, sanctions movement, and we really mostly focus on the S, the sanctions. Like, we want to end US aid and US military aid to Israel. And we always think a very important demand to raise is the struggle for Palestinians to be able to return to their homeland. The right to return, we agree with the Palestinian movement, is not negotiable and is not something that should ever be taken off the table. For tonight's program, we have 3 speakers, and what we're going to do is first we're going to start here in Minneapolis, and we're going to look at George Floyd and the movement that's here in Minneapolis. Then we're going to look at the connections between police brutality in the US and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And then lastly, we're going to look at the current situation in Palestine and Israel's latest plan in their effort to try to steal Palestinian land. During the talk, you can type comments And so if normally you're a person who has a hard time being quiet at events, woohoo, you can be a big blabbermouth. You can type all sorts of stuff and you're not going to bother anybody. But also if you have questions and you're like, I don't want to wait till the end because I will have forgotten my question, type it now. Autumn, who will be emceeing the Q&A with me at the end, she is going to be keeping track of these questions and we're going to make sure that they get answered by our speakers. So you don't have to wait to the end. You can type your question in as it pops into your head. That is totally cool. And then we will use those questions in a discussion with our panelists. Okay. So we're going to start with our first speaker. Her name is Angel Buchner, and I've known Angel and have had the pleasure of protesting with her for a long time. Before her current situation where she's organizing with Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, Angel used to be in the Minnesota Welfare Rights Committee. And as a member of the Welfare Rights Committee, Angel has traveled with the Anti-War Committee on many a national bus trip to Washington, D.C., to New York, and has protested a lot of wars. But we're really excited to have her here today as a member of TCC4J, because TCC4J has been leading work on the ground, struggling for Black lives for the past 5 years since Jamar Clark was murdered in Minneapolis, and they are leading the fight locally for community control of the police. So we're going to turn it over first to Angel.
To me.
Yeah.
I'm unmuting myself, but it keeps going back. Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be a part of this panel and really excited to sit with you guys and just give you the dirty version of what's really going on in the streets and the struggle for Black liberation for all folks around the world. But I'll start off, I kind of wrote some things down, so I'll kind of be reading a little bit. I'll try to ad lib as much as I can, but I have a lot going on. So before the murder of George Floyd, Minneapolis was already on the edge with previous police killings. There had already been 20 cases that we knew of that were reported in 2019. The killings of Ronald Davis, Brian Quinones, Kobe Heisler, and I don't want to mispronounce this person's name, but I think they're of Muslim descent, so I will try my hardest. Sadah Mani and Isaac Aiden. What do all those names all have in common? They are people of color. And the list, of course, goes on and on. I only mentioned those few people just because those are the first ones that had national attention in what was going on here in Minnesota. People were tired and couldn't take another killing. This one was clear as day from the beginning to the end. The whole world watched a man be murdered on Facebook Live. People came together that night that George Floyd was killed and took to the streets. The takeover of the 3rd precinct was going to happen, and it did. For days, the uprising of Minneapolis took place, and it was led by Black and brown young folks who were fired up and tired of being killed by the hands of the police. The Memorial Day weekend murder of George Floyd was the Memorial Day weekend murder of George Floyd was taking place during a global economic crisis and global pandemic that was unchecked by capitalist greed and oppression. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. People couldn't believe that police officers literally put a knee to the neck and killed him. A couple of things I want to add about what was going on and what probably charged people up and got people actually motivated to move. Floyd wasn't resisting and said he would get in the squad car, but he was claustrophobic and was scared because he was hurt already, so he was afraid to get in the car by the police. He pleaded for his life, begging for the police to get off of his neck because he couldn't breathe. It was being Facebook lived by a civilian, and we watched him beg and cry out for his deceased mother. And I think right there was what hit most people. And also his deceased mother, it was the anniversary of her death on Memorial Day. I know as a mom, and watching that video and hearing him cry out for his mother broke me up. And it still breaks me up. I still get teary-eyed by that. But that's because I just got the heart, So those are things that I think really fired up. And I also want to add that this is why the murder of George Floyd spoke to people globally. And I'm talking about globally, like we had people coming in from all over the states. And I mean people literally, other people of police killings, but also just people in general were like looking and saw that video and felt Minnesota's pain and felt the seriousness of how these murderers of police brutality need to stop on our community. Why is it important for the anti-war committee to be a part of the movement for Black lives? The same knee of capitalist oppression on the Black folks' neck is the same knee on the neck of the rest of the world. We have 400 plus years of slavery of Black people in the US, but this same war machine that is used across the globe is also used here at home against Black and brown indigenous and working class folks. I believe the connection with Palestine in many ways is our Palestinian brothers and sisters helped in Ferguson. They helped in Ferguson by telling the brothers and sisters there what to use and what kind of equipment to have to protect their bodies and types of medicines to use with the mechanical warfare. That's solidarity regardless. They're showing you what weapons to use to fight back and what weapons to use to heal your body. Also, TC4J was one of the organizations that was proud to help fight the fight for Rosemia Oda, who is a very known Palestinian liberation worker. And we were proud to stand with her in her case and try to get her justice. And that is a connection in itself. We made those connections very clear because people abroad are being oppressed by the United States. And that same knee that was put on George Floyd is the same knee that they're using in Palestine and that they will continue to use unless the people stand up and fight back. So some things that TC4J is doing, because I'm all fired up now, I'm going to get into this, is we have CPAC, and I just want to take it here. Give me one moment to just pull up some notes on my CPAC because this is important legislation that we have going on right now. And there's some confusion by what the so-called Democrats and abolish and defund Minneapolis charter amendment. That's the bullshit amendment. That's not community control. Community control is this here. Our demand is the highest level of police reform possible in a capitalist system. It comes from the multinational working class and not the cronies in power who have let the police kill us. It is a long-term demand. It is a long-term demand of the Black community for liberation and self-determination in all oppressed nations in the U.S. It changes the power structure that is policing in Minneapolis and across the U.S. We have a program that is supported by a real movement, real demands, and real people who aren't a part of the problem. If you need any further evidence, Google us, boo. Like Google TC for J. We know you want to know about community control of the police and real legislation. Get with TC for J. We got it. We got you covered. So, regardless of that stuff that got passed today, that bull stuff that Wall signed off on today, we are going to continue to fight for community control, and we'll be in the streets until community control happens. Power to the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angel. When I went to Palestine in 2002, I think the most important lesson I learned is that activism is a marathon and not a sprint. You know, the people that I met in Palestine had been working for decades and had no intention of letting go and of ever stopping until they got their land. And I feel like that is a lesson that people right now need to learn from. Like, we are literally protesting every day at some action or another for Black lives in Minneapolis. And so we are having this discussion right now about, like, you know, this is a marathon and not a sprint, but we got to have the long-term vision, because it's not just about getting this one demo done. It's about, we want to win and we want to grow this movement. And I learned that from the Palestinians. And I think that a lot of people are learning that right here in our own country right now from the movement for Black lives. Thank you. Our next speaker is Danya Zituni. She is a member of the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, and she's currently based in Detroit. She used to be in Chicago. Previously, she was a staff member for the Arab American Action Network, the AAAN, and she was active with USPCN in Chicago. And we asked Danya here tonight to be able to talk about the connections between policing in this country and the Israeli occupation. And so thank you, Danya, so much for zooming in with us from Detroit.
Did I unmute? Okay, thank you. And thank you, Angel. That was really moving. And we really need CPAC. We need it everywhere. So again, I'd like to thank Anti-War Committee for hosting the webinar and the panelists for your important work. And I think I'm just gonna start by saying, like, two of the most important political positions that we take as USPCN that I think are relevant for how I'd like to frame this topic is that, one, the Palestinian Liberation Movement is part and parcel of the global movement against the system of US imperialism, which I think, Meredith, you hit on really well. And number two, the Palestinian movement in the US must unconditionally support the number one threat to US imperialism internally, which is the Black liberation movement. So what we're seeing today, you know, these post 9/11 police exchange programs with thousands of US police, ICE, FBI, and Border Patrol agents are being sent on these sponsored trips to train alongside Israeli police and military, concretely exposes for us a few important facts. And I'm going to focus on three, you know, for the sake of time and clarity. One is that Zionism is an unrepentant enemy of the Black liberation movement. Two, the true nature of policing in the US and is practiced by the State of Israel are both the role of occupation forces. And three, lastly, our movements are stronger and more effective when we make these practical connections about who our common enemies are, who our real friends are, and what we can learn from each other's lived experiences. So, these exchange programs, which are partially paid for by public funds, our taxpayer dollars, are also financially sponsored by Zionist organizations in the US, like the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and of course, AIPAC. And these programs train US police and federal law enforcement in tactics like crowd control, use of force, and surveillance. And what's important to know is that post 9/11, amid this war on terror, Israel has positioned itself as a global leader in developing its own counterterrorism technology and strategies that are marketed as battle tested on Palestinians. So the Atlanta Police Department, for example, explicitly claims it models its surveillance techniques on Israel, specifically the Israeli Command and Control Center that exists in Jerusalem to control Palestinian movement. The St. Louis police, after the Ferguson uprising that Angel touched on, has started to stockpile a new Israeli weapon on the market called skunk water. And this skunk water is released at a high pressure from a cannon or a grenade or a canister, and the liquid emits an odor that has been described as a mix of rotting animal carcasses and raw sewage. And Palestinians whom this weapon has been tested on claims that the smell lingers on your skin for up to weeks and can't be washed away during that time, to the point where you desire to rip off your own skin. Now, this is not to say, US police would not be racist if they weren't trained by Israelis. And I think, none of us here think that the US police in general simply need better training. The reality is that the function of Israel is that it's an extension of US imperialism operating as a colony on Arab lands. It's not an aberration of US foreign policy. It is a central part of US imperialism. So this means US police and Israeli police actually share the same material interests. And we can clearly see this. US police are equipped with military-grade equipment, as are the IDF. They're given the impunity to use immense levels of violence, including counterinsurgency tactics, to protect corporate property like the Walmarts and the Starbucks that are actually leeching off of the community and leaving people in a state of exploitation and powerlessness. This is basically a form of colonial occupation. Now, Zionists are not just sharing, weapons and tactics with US police. We also know they have been doing intensive intelligence gathering on our movements for decades in the US, doing the work for the US government. And one example I want to give from the 1980s, there was a spy from the Anti-Defamation League who gave information on the revolutionary South African anti-apartheid icon, Chris Hani. And, on his return home to South Africa, the ADL sold that information to the South African apartheid intelligence services, and he was later assassinated. The ADL also extensively spied on left-wing Arab organizers in the US from the 60s until the 80s in collaboration with US police and FBI. So, this is why it's so important we oppose these police exchanges. There are real consequences that are threatening our abilities to organize and that are threatening people's lives. As Angel mentioned, Black and Palestinian people, they're being targeted and assaulted with the same exact weapons, the same exact tear canisters, and the same style of counterinsurgency tactics. They've been able actually to share advice on how to deal with these tactics. how to treat wounds, how to deal with tear gas. And in my opinion, most importantly, what we can connect is providing a source of encouragement and inspiration, because every blow that we land and every struggle that we win is against one common enemy, right? So I'll end by mentioning one inspiring victory from 2019. There was a coalition of organizers in the Bay Area that actually put an end to the largest militarized SWAT program, SWAT training program in the world, that included apartheid Israel. And this was led by our comrades, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, Critical Resistance, the Filipino organization Bayan, and the Chicano Moratorium Coalition. So, we had this entire amazing history of anti-colonial struggles, both here and around the world, that we should learn from, and we can apply some successful lessons to our organizing today.
Thank you very much, Danya. I love how you ended with an example of a victory. I think that's super important. And I also love the way that you gave that context. The Anti-War Committee a couple years ago did a summer book group where we read this book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, which, if you haven't read, it has a chapter. It's called Shared Values, Shared Struggles, which talks a lot about some of the things that Danya talked about in terms of connections. And it talks about how one of the things that Israel, its sports in terms of its weapons technology, is its ability to put together demographic units, i.e. racial profiling. And that they specifically have, and he mentions Minneapolis in the book, and that Minneapolis police have used this type of information from the Israelis in order to target Somalis here in our own community. And so I think that's important for people to understand. And so this book would be good if you wanted to read more about what Danya was talking about, but also if you wanted a good introduction to Palestine in general. It's a very accessible book. So that provides us with our next sort of like where we're going next, which is that we're going to talk about what is going on the ground right now. For those of you who don't know, who is new to the situation in Palestine, things have gotten really weird during the Trump administration. I mean, just to be clear, every American president is BFF with Israel, so that's not new. That's not something unique to Trump. But he's the first president to do things like overtly be, he thinks that the settlements are great. He moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He's just been incredibly brazen in his, pro-Israeli approach, and hasn't really even tried to. Normally, presidents have put forth this this charade of wanting to be a peacemaker, but I would argue you can't really be a peacemaker if you're arming one side to the teeth of $13 million a day. But he doesn't even put on that sort of charade. So we are seeing sort of a different manifestation of the way that the U.S. is supporting Israel and their, everyday effort to steal land. So to talk to us about that, Tessneem Abdallah is going to be speaking with us, and she is here in Minnesota. She's on the board of American Muslims for Palestine, Minnesota, and previously was a member of Students for Justice in Palestine. So welcome, Tessneem.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you for having me, and thank you to our previous panelists. You guys were both amazing. I'm always really humbled when I sit on panels or webinars, because I end up learning more from everybody else than I end up, giving. So thank you. So like Meredith said, I'm going to talk a bit about the recent kind of uproar of annexation. So about a month ago, Israel had announced that July 1st was going to be annexation day. So on annexation day, the plan was to annex 30% of the West Bank, and 90% of which is from Area C, which is the largest area in the West Bank. Area C makes up about 60% of the West Bank, with about 100,000 Palestinians living there, whereas Area A and B are home to 2.8 million Palestinians. The annexation was planned to be along the Jordan Valley, and it essentially boxes Palestinians in, stripping them away from their Jordanian neighbors. So they no longer have a shared border at that point. And so July 1st came and went, and there was no annexation. But the idea of annexation caused a lot of uproar internationally. We even reached a point where Congress members drafted a letter pledging to condition aid to Israel if they followed through with this annexation. But the reality is that annexation has been happening all along. This was not a recent decision. The end goal of the state of Israel has always been the complete colonization of Palestine. This is nothing new. When you hear about annexation, it's been happening. It happens on a daily basis. It first happened back in the 40s when 70% of the Palestinian land was annexed by Israel, and it was normalized by the international community. And since it continues to happen through settlements, land grabs to build the wall, the apartheid wall, and other systems in place that continue the apartheid. And so on Area C, where the majority of this recent annexation was supposed to take place, there are already over 200 settlements with over 400,000 Israeli settlers living there. And so the idea here was to absorb those settlements to be under Israeli control. So the announcement of Annexation Day essentially takes this act from the reality that's happening on the ground, so a de facto annexation, to a legally backed matter which is called a de jure annexation. Essentially, a de jure annexation gives Israel the right to annex land, which keeps the Israeli Supreme Court from declaring any sort of land grab in the area as illegal. So essentially, if Israel went and annexed a privately owned Palestinian land, the Supreme Court can't say that it's illegal because it's under de jure annexation. So while this annexation didn't happen on July 1st, it is ongoing, and we need to be just as enraged as we were when we heard about it, because every day it's the same thing, right? The apartheid continues, occupation continues. It was just 2 days ago that Israel destroyed a COVID testing center in the West Bank. Sorry, in the West Bank, because the occupation and colonization didn't start or end with this annexation plan. Excuse me. And it also didn't start or end with the Trump administration and their continued support of Israel. Just like what Meredith had said beforehand, the U.S.-Israeli relationship has been strong and ongoing for the past 72 years, over 72 years from before the establishment of the Israeli state. And so it's not really about, while Trump has been more brazen, as Meredith said, it really isn't specifically about him. Anyone we put in the White House would probably support this plan just as much as Trump does. But what our Congress members had right this time around was that there was a threat to condition funding to Israel. And so we really see that the discourse in America is shifting. And we're seeing it more and more as politicians are speaking up against Israel's continued violence, including having Bernie Sanders come out speaking out against the continued settlement, and speaking out and also supporting conditioning aid to Israel. But we also have now Congress members such as AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Betty McCollum, all of whom had signed on. And Betty McCollum has a bill in which she's proposing that we, as the U.S., have more stricter rules, I guess, in terms of what that money is being used for, and specifically for it not to be used against children being illegally detained. Excuse me. So we currently give Israel $3.8 billion from our taxpayers' money every single year. And this is solely to continue to grab more land and to continue to ethnically cleanse Palestinian people. And so what we really need to work towards as a larger community advocating for Palestine is to move from threats to action, and to see this happening in the near future. Because if it doesn't, then we're just going to continually see Israel ethnically cleansing Palestinians. And it's really on us in the US to be the ones that are pushing for our money not to go abroad. And so I hope that that's something that we can continue to work towards. And I'll end it here, so maybe we can do some questions or whatever you'd like to do next.
So first, I want to give a round of applause for our speakers. And I'm positive that people are clapping at home. And we have actually gotten a lot of questions. I first just want to piggyback off of what Tessneem said, is that in my time doing activism on this question, and it hasn't been as long as many people, but it has been, 2 decades. And I can say that I have been incredibly impressed by the impact of our work. Like the fact that Palestine and USA to Israel was actually a question in the Democratic presidential debate. That is the result of this movement's work, because that wouldn't have happened otherwise, and the fact that it's actually a question right now in terms of Ilhan Omar's reelection campaign. It shouldn't be, but it is. But there is like an actual conversation that's ongoing about the situation and support between the US and Israel, and there is space to question it. There's space to ask that, and I think that's awesome. All right. So
sorry, to follow up on that, just seeing the reaction and the money that's going in to stop Ilhan Omar from being reelected just tells you like how much of a pain this is. And so like it's a risk, and it's amazing to see these mostly women are taking this stance. And so I mean, even no matter how much I've been working in this space, every time I see it, I still get excited, and it's still almost like brand new.
No, it is exciting, and I agree that there is a pushback. Like, it's not like people are like, okay, we'll see the debate to you. But I mean, there is pushback, but there's an actual conversation that's happening. And we've fought for decades just to have this question, like the right to question the US's relationship with Israel. That has been hard, without having it just be, oh no, you're anti-Semitic. So I think that that's been in of itself a victory. So we've got some questions that have been coming in. My co-chair for the Q&A is Autumn. She is also with the Anti-War Committee, and we're going to turn it over to Autumn, who needs to unmute herself, and she's going to ask the first question. And any panelist can answer, and it doesn't have to be just that you're answering the questions that are related to what you spoke about, because the fact is that, so I want, people to be able to feel like they can jump in, and we'll get through as many questions as we have between now and 8:30. So go for it, Autumn.
Hey everyone, so once again, my name is Autumn. I'm a member of the Anti-War Committee. We've been getting questions through the live stream, through other sources as well, so we're going to try to knock these out real good. We have a question from Tommy. Do you see a similarity between Israeli settlers and the US religious right? And how are these groups influenced by their respective police forces?
Who would like to take a stab at that one? Go for it.
I don't know that I don't know that I'm the most qualified to speak on this.
You can get it started, and then if Danya wants to jump in, or if I want to jump in, or Angel, that's fine. You go ahead. You get started.
I think one thing that we see, like the most glaring similarity, is that they're protected, right? Like Israeli settlers are protected when they are clearly being violent towards Palestinians. And it's the same here. We've all gone to have like a million protests all together, and we see how folks here are protected when they're opposing us, whereas when it's a Black Lives Matter protest, the protesters are all of a sudden, they don't matter. They're not the ones that are being protected by the police. So I think that's the most glaring similarity to me, that they truly are being protected by the police and by the IDF in Palestine.
Danya, do you want to jump in? Oh no, Angel, go for it. You got to unmute yourself though.
All right. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, just to kind of go off of some of that, like I noticed like protests with the right, like the right folks will have protests at the governor's mansion. They'll have guns. They'll have all kinds of stuff. And the police are nowhere to be found. Nowhere. Not bugging them, not swirling the corner, not waiting for them at the end. You see some black folks coming up, 10 deep, cops swirling right there. They pull up, whoop whoop, and it happens. Like, it really happens. Like, we can't stand in front of the governor's office, in front of his mansion, because of our skin color, and we protesting about people killing us. That oppression is the same thing I feel like is happening in Palestine. I will never call it Israel, because it's not. It's Palestine. It's always going to be Palestine. They can't change the name. They can't move the map. It's going to be Palestine forever. Free Palestine.
All right. Danya, do you want to weigh in or no?
Man, okay, Angel got it, but I'll add one small thing. I would say there's also like a comparison, I think, in terms of like the ideology, you know, Zionism and like the other founding ideology of the US, Manifest Destiny, like they're actually very similar in terms of like you believe there's this kind of like divine right to this land, which, you know, doesn't make any sense at all, has no logical basis, it doesn't, you know, there's nothing that is based in reality. And I think, you know, that connection definitely can be made in terms of like who actually does the land belong to, and who the police is protecting the land for. Like, even the name Homeland Security is like anti-indigenous. So that's my 2 cents.
That's awesome. I have nothing to add. I think our panelists, like, they nailed it. We're going to go next to, how can we stop American police forces from training with Israelis? This is a question that we have been debating in the anti-war committee, and I think it'd be great to have some insight from both Palestinian organizers as well as the BLM movement.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question for me?
You bet. How can we stop? So Danya talked about like how American police forces are training with Israelis and about that sharing of techniques. And so in the anti-war committee, we've been having a discussion about like, how can we stop American police forces from training with Israelis? Like, how can we try to sever that relationship between local police forces and the Israeli sort of trainings and like exchange programs that they offer?
Well, I want to say some this is just on a tactical note. Take over their precincts and burn them down. Just saying. But really, we need to defund the police for real. Like, we need to stop spending bukus of money go into the police budget for them to keep sending, to keep I don't know, I mean, I have all kinds of grandiose ideas about how to do this, but one of them is to start somewhere with how this money is being funneled through the United States to these police officers. I don't know, how we could go about doing that, finding out things or ways to divest in certain things. Those are just some ideas. I'm still learning about. I know about Palestine because my good friend Meredith tells me about Palestine all the time. We've been kicking it for years, but I'm still learning the logistics of like money and how this whole war machine keeps going over and killing my sisters and brothers in Palestine, and then coming over here and doing the same thing, and I'm open to ideas and anything like that. So y'all might have to teach me, but I know one thing is to start by stop somehow with the money issue, and I'm serious, take over their precincts.
Danya and Tessneem, do you guys have anything you want to throw in for how to try to sever this relationship?
Yeah, I would add on to what Angel said. It would depend first on what's the source of funding. like specific to where you live. Like there's different varieties of these programs because there's different funders for them. There's ADL sponsored police exchange. There's the APAC sponsored. There's ones that it could be your specific city is funding it. So you would want to look at what is the specific source of funding in your own city, and then that would determine what step you need to take. You know, is it going to take like you need to pass like some sort of resolution in the city council saying we commit to not funding this anymore, or is your target going to be the ADL? That's a bit harder. It's like you're trying to move a rock. Like I don't know how you're gonna have to have some mass pressure to try and get the ADL to stop doing what they do. Like that's their bread and butter. So I mean, that's something I'm definitely interested in. And I think the example from the Bay Area where they actually shut down Urban Shield, the largest SWAT training program in the world, we can look at kind of how they actually developed that mass pressure necessary. I think it took about 5 years before they won. So definitely, you know, echoing what Meredith said earlier, it's a marathon to actually win these type of demands.
Anybody else want to jump in on this question? Go for it, Autumn.
So if my understanding is correct, the question is, what can we do to stop American police forces from training with Israelis?
Mhm.
So, one campaign that's being worked on locally by groups like Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar is, of course, CPAC, the Civilian Police Accountability Council, the aim of which is to provide a community-based civilian oversight and decision-making process for police departments. The idea here, right, is that if we leave the decision-making process for the police department in the hands of the mayor, the city council, these career politicians, they won't actually serve the interests of the people living in the city. We can't trust them to defund, dismantle, abolish, anything like that if it's in their hands. So if we put power in the hands of the people, we can say, no, no more training in Israel. Cut the budget and you're not getting it back. These things will only happen if we implement a civilian police accountability council. So for that reason, in the anti-war committee, we tend to support Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar's demand for community control of the police. And I believe that is the best way moving forward to deliver on these goals. And if no one else is going to pop in and answer this question, I'll ask the next one. Is everyone ready? I saw a couple small nods. We're good. All right, excellent.
Go for it.
So, one question we have is how can we connect the movement for Black Lives with the struggle of Palestinians, with the Palestinian Liberation Movement? Who wants to take that one first?
Well, I believe I touched on some of that. The connections have always been made, right? Like Palestine and Palestinian people are us. Black folks are Palestinians. We're the same. You know what I'm saying? Our struggle is the same. The connection is there. They're being oppressed by the US. We're being oppressed by the US. There's no difference in the connection there. They running them down with bulldozers and cushion grenades and all kinds of rubber bullets and whoever knows what else. They did the same thing here when George Floyd was killed. They did the same thing here. Every time we step up and try to do something, they come at us regardless. That's how you intertwine the two. There's no separate, Palestine is not separate from BLM, and BLM is not separate from Palestine. And once everybody realizes that, when Palestine and Black people get together, look at what happens. The fist, these will become one. And then we fight.
I wouldn't want to be the person that follows up Angel, but if someone wants to, that's totally fine.
I mean, I 100% agree with that. I think the connections are there. We don't necessarily have to like make them up or fabricate them. They're there. And I think the biggest thing is just learning and taking the time to understand the history behind both struggles and like how we overlap. And really, like, even if you can't, historically, of course, there's differences, but our biggest connection is that we're both resilient, and like that's what connects us, our resilience. And so just continuing to be informed and learn and show up for each other, I think that's something that we as a Palestinian community, we've been doing, but we can always do better, is showing up. I don't think we can say, like, I can say Black Lives Matter, but until I show up for my Black brothers and sisters, or then it's just words, right? So we got to show up for each other. That's the biggest thing.
I want to add one more thing. Just one more thing. The power of Black and brown people and the stuff that we have been gone through, we will never stop fighting for our determination. Do you know why? Because the bull crap that they have put us through only makes us fight harder. As slaves for 400 years, we're still going through this stuff in 2020. It's coming up to be 2021. And I still ain't equal to my sister and brother as a white in white folks' land. All right? So I'll tell you, that's one thing about us. We're resilient people. And I mean that with all of our heart. You can't take our pride and you can't take our fight.
Danya, did you want to throw in on this question?
I mean, after Angel,
But you
y'all,
have a
Angel
sparkle in your
is
eye. Like I could tell you have ideas.
Angel's hitting it out of the park. I'll add one small thing. I think like there's like some real contradictions in the Arab community. Like, we're a colonized community, but we actually need to do the work that is consistent and that is like not glamorous, of going into our community and educating them step by step, face to face, saying what are the real connections between our struggles, and also getting rid of anti-Black racism that does exist in our community. It's not enough for us to be those like internet people that say like, this is, don't use this word, don't use this term. Like, let's do the work. Like, let's put it into practice. Because at the end of the day, the only way that we're going to transform our community into action is by actually mobilizing them, not posting something that probably 2-3 people are going to read on the internet who already agree with you. And as USPCN, we like, specifically in Chicago, we supported the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression for years, supporting the demand for CPAC, and had the largest non-Black contingent at one of their historic protests in 2015, the March Against Police Crime. So Arabs and Palestinians, we need to support Black leadership in the movement against police crimes. We need to support actually transformative legislation like CPAC, which there's nothing else like it, and support, the families and the survivors who are impacted by police crimes. And that's the way that we can continue to make these connections, I think.
Thank you. When we were occupying the front lawn of our local prosecutor, who never prosecutes anyone never prosecutes any cops for killing anybody, except for one white woman once because we made him. But aside from that, he doesn't ever prosecute crimes. Mike Freeman. We were hanging out on his front lawn for days while we were trying to pressure him to do something about George Floyd. we had a protest, and both Miriam from AMP and myself spoke, and both of us, tried to make these connections between what was happening in Minneapolis and what was happening in Palestine. And we just had, it was a really beautiful protest of Black people and Arab people and a bunch of people who look like Minnesota all together, but like spontaneously different points in the protest, like people would start chanting "Free Palestine." And I just thought it was a beautiful example of how people saw these struggles as connected. And I thought it was really important that when we were hanging out for, days trying to make Mike Freeman, to do the right thing, which he didn't end up doing, but that, the position was that, decision was taken out of his lap and given to Keith Ellison. But I thought it was really important that there were Palestinians who were there at Mike Freeman's house, and that there were Palestinians who were at presence frequently at 38th and Chicago, where George Floyd was killed. Like, I feel like that's been really important, that people in Minneapolis have seen, have been making those acts of solidarity important and personal. Go for it.
I come in on that, what you were saying, and I think the anti-war committee has a big thing into making those connections happen. Shout out to the anti-war committee. You know what I'm saying? You all make those connections and make it to where the people can understand that these things are together no matter what. And my sister down here, the one that's in Detroit now, and you said how we have to go out and talk to people and stuff like that. What makes them have the racism against Black people? The US government. They're not racist against Black people because they're just racist. They're racist against Black people because they've been brainwashed and they need to have their mind re-registered to what's really going on in the movement. And it's going to take the movement to tell them that the government is lying to them. Get with anti-war committee. Let them show you how to make those connections with the Arab community and the Black people here, and then become that mighty fist to blow everything up. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you for the shout out, Angel. All right, our next question is from Tracy. She asks, why does Israel want to annex land for Palestinians? Who benefits from this, and why is Trump supporting it if the US doesn't get anything?
I can go first. So Israel's entire existence is based off of colonizing Palestine, and that happens through annexation. And so it's not they benefit, Israel benefits by learning more and more, right? And so that's the clear reason why they want to annex. What Trump has there, that's just kind of what it's honestly what it boils down to, is that Israel is they're our only friend in the Middle East, right? We've made plenty of enemies. And so when the US is constantly backing Israel and pushing for more annexation, more settlements and land grabs, that's just giving Israel what it wants, because it's the only friend we have there, right? And so that's basically what the US gains off of backing Israel up. It boils down to politics of foreign policies that are foreign politics, where we have no control over, we have no friends in the Middle East. And so we just keep that one friend that we have, and we keep giving them what they want. Because if Israel goes down, this is it for us. We don't have any friends there. Maybe if anyone else wants to add to why that is.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to what Tessneem said. This idea of this special friendship that the US has with Israel, the US has a lot to gain from Israel expanding its colonial project, as Tessneem said, because look at the way that the US has used Israel historically. They use it as a launch pad for wars, not only across the Middle East, but they've used it as a launch pad to support wars in Latin America and Africa. They've trained and advised, right-wing paramilitary groups in places like Haiti and Honduras, Nicaragua, Venezuela. This has been happening for decades now. So Israel is not like this extreme version of US foreign policy. It is US foreign policy. It is how it accomplishes a lot of its foreign policy. And the same way that the US was supporting and aiding apartheid South Africa until the very end. And then they're like, we don't support it. But it was like, y'all, come on. You supported it until the very last minute. So I think this is how we have to have kind of this international perspective for why the US continues to do this. But it's of course, Israel has a special role in the Arab world. We can't forget it's occupying Syria. It's invading Lebanese land and airspace every day. And it is attacking the Lebanese resistance every day as well.
Before we move on to the next question, I do want to just add on one little thing. I don't know if everyone remembers this, but in the early 90s, Joe Biden was giving a speech in the Senate about the state of Israel. And one of the things he brought up is that if the state of Israel did not exist, that the US would have to create it, specifically because it serves an important role for US foreign policy in the Middle East. It's not some secret agenda. It's something that the United States absolutely admits to. It admits to sustaining this colonial project, to have a foothold in that region, to continue to engage in imperialist campaigns all around the world. Not a conspiracy theory when it comes from the mouth of our own politicians. And on that note, I will take one more of our questions real quick. Let's see. From Kent, I've seen numerous examples of Israeli security forces using the kneeling chokehold on Palestinians, the same chokehold that Derek Chauvin used to murder George Floyd. Are there other tactics, methods, and actions that U.S. police forces use that are taught by Israeli security forces?
Am I supposed to answer that?
If you'd like.
I think there's a lot of methods. There's like too many to name. The methods that Israel uses in the West Bank is mainly the crowd control methods that the US then, implements and uses. I think, this idea of, tracing people's social media posts to find specific phrases that now we're seeing is being used to retroactively hunt down activists. This is like a very popular method used by Israel online, digitally surveillance. The method of, tracing people's movements through surveillance drones. Israel is the world's largest exporter of drones. The US is a purchaser of these drones. Some of them are armed drones that are also used to harm people at protests. So there's a variety of tactics. There's also like specific weapons and technology that I had mentioned before that Israel develops itself and the US then purchases. A lot of these weapons, if it's not for crowd control, are tested on the occupied Gaza Strip. So things like sound bombs, things like chemical weapons, things like, even like some types of guns and things like that, especially like the laser guided technology that they market it as this is field tested. So then the US feels comfortable, like this is going to be effective. So I think there's a variety, and there's a lot of research that is out there if you look into it, if you're interested in that.
I specifically will chime in on that drone thing. So there was a live where these young teenage girls went to a beach, and the beach was predominantly all white folks, but they had one of their black friends with them. She was the only black chick in the whole beach, literally. She was the only black teenager. And, kids being kids, they did a little skinny dipping thing or whatever, and they took off their tops. They were way out on one of the docks or whatever. And the drone beamed in on them skinny dipping. And then the police came to the beach and specifically went to the black teenager and arrested her. Nobody else, just her. Everybody's like, what the hell? I took my top off too. What are you going to do? Why did you have a drone spying on us? What the hell? But they only specifically took the black teenager. I mean, what's that tell you? They spying on us. That's the type of crap that they use overseas, and now they doing that stuff here. I remember specifically during the uprising here in Minneapolis, seeing a lot of, and yes, it's an uprising, seeing a lot of military helicopters over between Minneapolis and St. Paul, just all over, and they were military. They weren't normal helicopters. I could see the missiles off of the things. They were flying low. These are the types of things that they use abroad, and now they're bringing that here to use it to use that. Look what they did when they shut the city down, and they brought in all those troopers, and how they used the type of things that they used, and those are the same types of weapons they use abroad. They use them here on people. You know what I'm saying? Whacking them with the batons and playing the loud siren things to make people go, to go away and stuff. And I won't mention any names, but that was all caught on film from a young lad who took to the streets and filmed everything. And he was a young black young man who showed everything. He showed all kinds of stuff, and how people were being treated, how the police militarized Minneapolis, because the governor called them in to do that. He called in the troopers to come in because they had absolutely no idea what to do. You know what I'm saying? So you gonna call in the goddamn army to take care of the people when the first thing you should have done was A, implement CPAC, B, get the fucking killer cops off our streets, and C, stop giving money to those assholes because they keep killing us.
Tessneem, you wanted to jump in too.
Yeah, first of all, amen to that. Second of all, so other than crowd control, I don't know specific tactics, but one thing that came to mind was that within the last year, the Anoka County Sheriff was also trained in Israel under the Jewish Institute for National Security of America's Homeland Security Program. And they specifically say that he went to learn about preventing and responding to terrorism and human trafficking. And so obviously, we know what that means when we talk about preventing terrorism in this country. There's entire programs in place to essentially fabricate it and target people of color, and specifically Muslims in this country. And so just kind of drawing that parallel of how Israel sees Palestinians in Palestine as terrorists, and how here we're seen as terrorists as well. And so they just, bond over over that similarity of criminalizing Muslims across the world. And so that's another thing that came to mind in terms of like their similarities and things that they exchange.
Excuse me. Jeez. If no one has any follow-up from that, I'll move on to our next question. Sound good? All right, big approval. Here we go. Um, another question we received is, the annexation was delayed. What do you think will happen next? Will they just do it later? Will they just do it quietly? And why do you think they delayed it in the first place?
There's
you say-
no clear.
Sorry, can you say
Donna,
delayed
go
what?
ahead. Sorry, Angel, you were speaking. Go ahead.
I didn't hear the question. Can you say delay what? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll read the question again, no problem. So the annexation was delayed. What do you think will happen next? Will they just do it at a later time? Will they just do it quietly? And why do you think they delayed it in the first place? Tessneem, you look like you wanted to go first.
Sure. I don't think there's a clear answer to why it was delayed and what the next steps are. It's honestly all very like vague. July 1st means nothing. They just kind of picked the date and went with it. And so the thoughts are that it was delayed because of the current COVID pandemic, and Israel's numbers are on the rise. And so that's the thought behind it. What's going to happen next, we don't really know. The reality is whether or not they announce it, it has been happening and will continue to happen and is happening right now. And so that's what's going to happen next is really like no one really knows, but I wouldn't say that the annexation isn't happening actively.
Danya or Angel, do you have any additional input?
I really don't know nothing about it. I do apologize. I'm willing to be educated though.
I think I would also add, part of the reason it's delayed, we have to acknowledge there was massive resistance on the ground. The annexation was opposed all throughout the West Bank, all across historic Palestine. There was protests across the Arab world, massive protests in Jordan, and obviously protests, in the US as well and in other parts of the world. So I think we can attribute part of that to the reason why it was, delayed, even though, in the words of Tessneem, the annexation, this hasn't really stopped. It wasn't that nothing happened July 1st. They're continuing to prepare to grab land and probably demolished homes on that day as well. So I think we have to just keep an eye out to see what they're planning.
I think Tasneem also did a good job in her original statement of talking about how there's actually been a debate in this current period about with the annexation about, okay, well, if Israel goes and does that, then there are actually people in Congress who are saying, well, then we should cut aid to Israel. That hasn't happened before, that you've actually had members of Congress. This is historically been an incredibly bipartisan issue, that everybody who's in the major parties loves to love Israel and is like, no, I love them more. No, I love them more. And so the fact that that was raised, I think that also scared people. I think they were like, and so I think that originally Trump was hoping that annexation would be a good win for him. And I think that obviously Netanyahu thought this was going to be a big win for him. Like they both needed one. Like things haven't been going super well for them. And I think that they were surprised that, this wasn't going to go that well for them. I do think it makes me wonder, like, obviously the desire for more land in the West Bank isn't going away. And so I think it is hard to predict like how that will manifest itself. And I also think that COVID plays a factor, but I also think the US elections play a factor. It'll be interesting to sort of, to see how that plays out. I do think it's going to be important for all of our viewers to be prepared, regardless of where you live, to be prepared to go to more protests. Because the fact of the matter is that we need to end US aid to Israel. And we need to say no to whatever's the next stage of what this annexation plan is. And so people should plug into whatever is their local organization that's going to be doing stuff to challenge US aid to Israel and to challenge the special relationship between the US and Israel. Is it my turn next, Autumn?
Yeah, it's your turn this time. No worries.
Okay. I might have been told that I asked questions too often. Just kidding. So I think this, depending upon how long this takes, this might be one of our last ones. Someone sent this in. So Trump has attempted this peace plan, this peace plan that his son-in-law has put forward, and it fizzled pretty hard. Like they put a lot of and coming out with it, and then it never really went anywhere. And our writer was hoping that one of you could talk about why that happened and sort of like what is Trump's agenda with talking about the, Palestine and Israel. So if someone could address Trump's attempted peace plan and sort of what Trump's interest is in talking about, Palestine and Israel. Go for it, Tessneem.
I don't know. I think this is really related to kind of our earlier question of why does Trump care so much about annexation and like support it so much. And it's continued support for their special relationship and their only friend. We all saw that plan. We all saw the maps and how big of a joke that was. I don't know that anyone can take that seriously and like go through with it. And I think that I worry that will actually end up happening. But I think in the near future, that's not something that I don't see that being accepted in the near future. I think what I worry more about is what we're building towards it by quietly accepting other things.
I'll just add that, I'm not no expert of Palestine or anything, but I know that Trump doesn't have no plans of peace for my Palestinian brothers or sisters, just like he don't have no plans of peace for Black and brown people in Minnesota or anywhere in the U.S. There is no plan of peace in that man's head. I don't even know if he has a head. To me, he's crazy. The man doesn't, I don't know what he's thinking with. I got all kinds of bad things I want to say about him, but I'll keep it clean for lies. I think the reason why that fizzled out is because there's no plan. Fake news. You know what I'm saying? Like he likes to say, fake news. This is a person who starts something and can't finish it. He talks about COVID like it's not real, and then it is. Wear your mask and don't wear it. People are dying, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, what the hell? He has no plan for anything. So, he definitely don't have no plans of peace in the Middle East at all. And it's going to take the resistance of the people here and abroad.
Danya, do you want to jump in on Trump's peace plan?
I'll add maybe one small point. I mean, like they both said, the plan basically now has become a non-starter. Like no one is even talking about this plan anymore. And the plan does connect to the annexation plan that we were talking about, because the plan requires annexation as well as massive population transfer, which is crime under international law. And I think it's clear, like, no one on the Palestinian side from the beginning was even willing to accept this plan. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we've seen it as a non-starter. You know, even the sellout Palestinian Authority is not willing to accept this plan. And it requires, one of the requirements is that Palestine does not try Israel in the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And like this, there's nothing acceptable about the plan. Like, no one from the left to the right is gonna accept it. So for now, it's just like the little card that they're gonna keep waving to say, like, look, the US and Israel are on the same page. And it's like, y'all, we already knew that. So.
I think the only other thing I would add to this discussion is that I think that Trump really hoped that bringing up the fact that I think he wants to sort of push this question of Palestine in an effort to try to divide the Democratic Party. And I think what's really interesting is that he doesn't understand that that's our goal too. Like, we also want to push this question of Palestine, and we want to make people talk about it, and we want to make people choose a side, and we want to educate people so they know what they're really choosing if they decide to stay on, you know, always standing with Israel regardless of their human rights record. And so I just think that that's been really interesting is that he feels like I think he sees this as a way to try to divide the Democratic Party. And I think that this is one of those moments where I'm like, go ahead, talk about your horrible ideas and see if that steals voters, because we're similar going to talk about your horrible ideas and organize our movement. So I think Autumn's going to read our last question because we have time for uno más.
Well, I actually have one final piece of input on this question before we move on to the next question. I'm greedy today, don't worry about it. So calling it a peace plan is like an interesting part of the legacy of the United States in its naming conventions for its most brutal and repressive policies. Whenever the U.S. put sanctions on Venezuela, which in 2018 caused the death of 40,000 poor working class Venezuelans, black and brown Venezuelans, right? They called that a human rights effort. A human rights campaign, even though it was clearly an act of aggression, an act of war against the Venezuelan people. So naturally, if Trump's calling something a peace plan, it's got to be the exact opposite. That's just how the United States government operates at this point. I won't belabor that point, though. I will move us on to our last question. So, what is our hope for the near term in Minneapolis and Palestine, and what's our hope for the long term? Who wants to go first? I feel like, I'm no rocket scientologist, right? But I feel like perhaps our two folks living in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities area, would like have the first input on Minneapolis. Call me crazy if that's wrong, but.
All right, I'll pop it off for y'all. So you said, what's the hope for long term and short term? Is that the question? All right. Well, long term is that we're going to continue to fight for CPAC because that's what we want. And CPAC is the way to go because that will get community control of the hands to the civilians, and so that we can get these crooked, dirty, filthy, killing pigs out of our neighborhoods. And also we're gonna have to push for that. We're gonna have to push for legislation. We're gonna have to keep on getting out in the community and telling people about CPAC and getting people on board for CPAC because that amendment charter that passed today, Democrat fluff. It wasn't real. So I said I see that as the long-term goal. And also starting to unite more with our Palestinian sisters and brothers, making those connections more hardcore, being there and showing up and showing out for each other at each event. BLM, Palestinian sister brother, come on over. Palestinians, defunding the funding money from going to Palestine and having the people getting the right to return to Palestine. Black and brown folks, get your ass over there and be with the Palestine people and anti-war community. Those are things that we need to keep doing and making those connections. I think we have to keep building between our Palestinian sisters and our Black and brown folks so that we can become a bigger force. And I see that as a short-term goal because I know our activists are badass and we can do that.
Absolutely. I think, I think you said it best, but so in Minneapolis, I think short and long-term goals would be, or long-term goal would be to defund the police and essentially just move towards community control, but also looking towards, or looking past just the police, but also looking at how just Minneapolis. Look at Minneapolis and the gentrification that's happening there. that's a long-term goal to like end that. That we can't continue to gentrify Black spaces and communities. It's just there's where like at this point where are Black folks gonna live? You know, we keep it's just they're constantly pushed out of their cities, and so that's I think looking at having equality within the education system, within the healthcare system, within our housing policies. Those are all things that I think are part of the long-term goal. I don't think that it's just not, not saying it's not sustainable is just an understatement. Like we cannot continue to allow Black folks and people of color to live like that in this country and in this city. I think in Palestine, to add to what Angel said, not just short term but long term, just having that solidarity between all of our movements, whether it's Black Palestinian solidarity or broader movements, but solidarity, and also for Palestine, of course, the end goal is freedom and liberty for Palestinians, and in every aspect. Short-term goal is to continue working towards boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning the state of Israel. This is, again, I think is one of the most powerful tools we have here in the U.S. because it's not, this is our best tool here. We are the ones that are giving the money. We need to demand that money stops going to Israel. And so I think those are, at the end of the day, the long-term goal for everybody is liberation for all of us.
Danya, did you want to weigh in on the long-term, short-term goals?
I think Tessneem hit it. For the Palestinian movement, BDS has always been the international call. And like, it's clear that in the case of apartheid South Africa, BDS played a huge role in putting international pressure to raise the economic cost and the social cost of the occupation, to say that, look, like there's a price to pay for occupying people. There's a high price, actually. And I think that we need to support anti-war and Palestinian organizing in the US, and also recognize that the Black Liberation Movement is anti-imperialist, because they are actually, striking huge blows against the same system that's oppressing us.
I want to jump in and say that I think that something that's really important that's happening right now that we're going to get a long-term benefit from is, so previously to the situation with the murder of George Floyd, we hadn't had very many protests, maybe any, in the Twin Cities of tens of thousands of people since the war in Iraq. so we had people who had been organizing in our movement but had never experienced, like, what do you do when 20,000 people show up? What do you do when 10,000 people show up? And now people have had real experience on the ground organizing protests where, like, you just have a bunch of contingencies you can't plan for, and you're just like, what do we do? And like people learn through doing. Like, you can't read a book on how to marshal a protest. You can't read a book on how to organize a protest that 20,000 people show up to do in a pandemic. Like, you learn by doing that. And what I love is that there are people who at the beginning of the summer were like, I'm new. And now they're telling other people how to organize and marshal a protest. I think that's really beautiful. And I think that we are in the process of giving people real life skills that they can use for Black Lives Matter, they could use for the anti-war movement, they could use for the environmental justice movement. I mean, they could use it for whatever, but we're not going to win if we don't have more people with us. And I feel like what we've seen this summer is more people with us, more people who've said, you know what? I don't think that the status quo is working, and I'm tired of sitting at home by myself being really scared about the future. I'm going to go do something. And so I just think that there have been more and more people who've been doing that. And I think that's been the most beautiful moment, in my opinion, of this moment. It is that people are standing up and fighting back and deciding to learn new skills and try new things. And that's how we're going to win. There has to be more of us. There have to be more of us, and there can't be more of us if there aren't more people who are organizers. And I feel like I've seen more people learn and become organizers this summer. And I think that's the thing that's going to be the most transformative for any of our hopes and future dreams in terms of long-term or short-term, is that we need to have more organizers.
I want to add to that, if I can. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, Autumn. Shout out to our youth. You know what I'm saying? Our youth has stepped up the game, yo. They have been out there doing the damn thing. I waited a long time to see that happen. And I am so excited to see these young, vibrant, Black, beautiful faces out there taking charge, and figuring it out, right? Really figuring it out. And like you said, Meredith, it's really, you have to be on the ground to learn this shit. You know what I'm saying? There's no manual. There's no manual of activism, because if there is one, somebody please put that book out and let's get paid. You know what I'm saying? But these young people have risen to the occasion. And I also want to give a shout out to the families of lost loved ones. Those folks have stepped up to the game. There has been many of them that have been hidden. There has been many of them that haven't been able to tell their stories. There has been many of them that didn't even know that there was such a movement that existed. And they have came out. And this, not to say that George Floyd, okay, look, I don't never use nobody's name in vain or nothing, but George Floyd has given people the platform to come out and do right. Rip to him, you know what I'm saying? Rip to him. God bless that man. It's sad what happened to him. It is sad how he died. It is sad that that was even posted and shown to the world, but it is also a blessing in disguise, because we got families coming out left and right that have been oppressed by the police state, have been too afraid to come out because they've been terrorized. You talk about terrorized. I know a woman, Tashir Galloway, her husband or her fiance, Justin Teagan, was killed by the St. Paul police, Emmett Till style. They threw that man in the garbage can. like he wasn't nothing. That's how they treat our Black men. That's how they treat all of our Black people. They treated him like he was nothing. He came across on a recycling bed with his body dangling and his head busted open, dripping down with blood. How would you feel if you saw your loved one come across on a recycling bin? It has to stop. And I praise every last one of these families who stood up, used their voice, and came out and came to Minnesota in droves to get their stories told. And I want them to continue to use this platform to raise their loved one in the highest way and get justice for all stolen lives.
You know, it's always a struggle trying to follow up Angel. You know, an enviable position because Angel speaks truth to power in ways that a lot of people would envy, including myself. But I'll try to speak anyway. As far as short and long-term goals for Minneapolis, right? As Angel has stated, a new iteration of this movement. We've seen so many more people come out. We'd be able to funnel those people to where they fit. We've not only seen the movement for Black Lives grow, we've seen the movements for immigrant justice grow. We've seen the anti-war movement grow because people are like incensed to the point where they said enough's enough. I have to do something. I have to find where I fit. And so the short-term goal in Minneapolis is to continue to grow these movements, not just the movement for Black Lives, but all of the movements for peace and justice. And the long-term goals, of course, you know, ending U.S. imperialism, community control of police, combating racism, environmental justice. These are the big, lofty marathon goals we all have. And we only get there by continuing to fight, continuing to bring out the numbers, continuing to recruit as we bring out these big numbers, and to provide a home for the people who have fire in their heart to keep fighting.
We want to say thank you to all of the people who have made this panel possible. We really appreciate that, Danya, you know, you're zooming in from Detroit, that Tessneem and Angel, that you guys were a part of this. I want to give a special shout out to Wyatt, who many of you don't know, who is behind the scenes doing all the tech work for this event. And Wyatt learned a bunch of skills this week. And that's super important because you got to have people who can learn new skills and learn how to do new things in a pandemic. And so shout out to Wyatt. We want to encourage people to follow the Anti-War Committee on Facebook. If you aren't already, we're going to be posting a call-in day that we're going to do on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week, where we're going to encourage people to call the Minneapolis City Council and the mayor to tell them that we want community control of the police, but that also we want the city of Minneapolis's police force to stop training with Israel and to stop coordinating with Israel, and that we're going to speak out against these types of tactics. And so that's a way that you can get involved, but we will keep you posted on other activities that we do. So if you aren't already following the Anti-War Committee on Facebook, you can. We're also on Instagram. We're also on Twitter. But so you should stay tuned for that event. We really want to appreciate people coming in and tuning in. It was very important that we had people who were able to make this happen, and viewers are a part of that. So thank you to the viewers, and thank you to everyone who submitted a question. So thank you. Free Palestine. And as we say in the Anti-War Committee, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine. So thank you very much.